Memory is a treacherous thing. It smooths the jagged edges of terror and paints a golden light on moments that were choked with dust and dread. But not terror. No memory cannot tame the siege. It remembers the truth. It remembers the dust. They say the dust of terror is ancient, that every particle is the remnant of some great historical moment, the ash of a saint's pyre, the powdered stone of a hero's statue. When I first set foot on the throne world, I did not think of history. I thought only of how it coated my tongue, a gritty film of churned earth, pulverized ferrocrete, and atomized metal. It was the taste of a world preparing for its own funeral. My name is Olin, and I was a soldier of the Thonian 18th the Headhunters, a proud name for a regiment drawn from the lightless gang warrens of a world that had already died once. We were not pilgrims. We were not crusaders. We were killers bred in tunnels and hive slums, sent across the galaxy to kill for an emperor we had never seen and a throne we could not comprehend. And now we had been brought to the heart of it all, not to be honored, but to die in its defense. Our arrival was not in triumph. The skies of Terra were not the brilliant blue of legend. They were a bruised ceiling of iron and smog choked by the sheer mass of starships hanging in orbit. They were not the elegant vessels of the Imperial Navy or the gilded barges of rogue traders. They were brutish, ugly things, mass haulers, prison ships, or freighters, anything that could carry 1 million souls and 1 billion tons of war materiel. They blotted out the sun, casting holy terror in a perpetual grim twilight. Our transport, the Graves Dew, was one such vessel, a repurposed cattle freighter that stank of ozone, unwashed bodies, and the faint coppery tang of fear. For weeks we had been crammed shoulder to shoulder in its cavernous holds, listening to the sermons of preachers promising glory and the rumors of veterans whispering of damnation. We Chthonians kept to ourselves. We were a breed apart, marked by the pallid skin of a world without a sun and the jagged glyph tattoos of the hive gangs that had birthed us. We spoke in our own cant a mix of low Gothic and the snarling dialect of our home. We were on Terra, but we were not of it. We were sons of Chthoniya, the same world that had spawned the arch-traitor, the War Master Horus. That fact was a brand upon our souls, an unspoken accusation in the eyes of every other soldier we met. The landing was a violent, jarring affair. The ship screamed its protest as it descended through the turbulent atmosphere. Then came the shuddering thud as it settled onto a landing field that centuries ago might have been a verdant park or the grounds of a nobleman's estate. Now it was just kilometers of scorched, reinforced plasteel. The great ramp slammed down, and the air of terror hit us. It was not the sacred air of pilgrimage. It was a chemical cocktail of promethium exhaust, overloaded power conduits, and something else, something acrid and low, the scent of massed, terrified humanity. We marched out in disciplined columns, our drab grey fatigues and battered flak armor a stark contrast to the Baroque splendor that was being systematically buried around us. This wasn't the terror of the pict cards and propaganda reels. This was a fortress. The grand avenues were now tank traps and trench lines. The soaring statues of primarchs and saints were draped in camouflage netting or half-buried behind newly erected blast shields. The golden filigree of palace spires was blackened by the exhaust of anti-air batteries that now nested upon their roofs. Everywhere the air hummed and cracked with the energy of countless void shield generators, their invisible power raising a shimmer in the air that made the world feel unreal, like a dream on the verge of becoming a nightmare. My squad shuffled to a halt in a marshalling area, the ground vibrating under our boots from the ceaseless movement of heavy machinery and the distant rhythmic stamp of legions of other soldiers. Millions upon millions of us drawn from every corner of the Imperium, a tidal wave of flesh and faith meant to break against the coming storm. I looked at the faces around me. Men I had known since the recruitment pens on Chthoniya. Jax with his crooked smile and the tattoo of the void vipers coiling up his neck. Rorik, his face a grim mask, his knuckles scarred from 100 hive fights. We were killers, yes, but here under this suffocating sky, we were just scared boys a long, long way from home, and then I saw it. Through a gap in the smog and the forest of newly constructed fortifications rising above everything was the palace. The Imperial Palace, the Sanctum Imperialis. The words themselves felt hollow, inadequate. It wasn't a building. It was a geographical feature, a mountain range of gold and marble and adamantium that scraped the heavens. It was too large, too ornate, too magnificent for the human mind to fully process. Its spires caught a sliver of the hidden sun and blazed with a light that seemed to mock the grime and squalor of the world below. It was the throne of a god, and I had never felt more mortal, more insignificant in my entire life. I stared at it, that impossible structure, the heart of the Imperium I was supposed to defend. It felt as alien to me as any Xenos ruin. It had no connection to the dark tunnels and acid rain skies of Chthoniya. It was a symbol of a power so vast and impersonal that my life, my death, the lives and deaths of my entire regiment were less than a rounding error in its grand calculus. We were here to be spent, to be ground into the dirt of this world, to buy it one more second, one more minute of existence. A commissar, his black coat immaculate, even in this dusty hell, strode past, his voice amplified by a vox-hailer. Regiment 18, Chthonian headhunters form up on the western line. You have been assigned to the Neptune Wall. The order broke the spell. I looked away from the distant blazing palace and back to the mud at my feet. The Neptune Wall. It was just a name, another line on a map that would soon be redrawn in blood. My blood. The blood of my brothers. We were just dust. Ancient dust, perhaps, but dust all the same about to be scattered by the coming wind. And in that moment I knew, with a chilling certainty, that no matter what happened, no one would ever remember our names. The Neptune Wall was not a wall, not in the way a man from a hive city understands the word. It wasn't a single solid barrier. It was a layered nightmare of plasteel and rockcrete, a defense in depth that stretched for kilometers, a scar of gray and brown against the tormented earth. Trenches deep enough to swallow hab blocks snaked between colossal bunkers. Fields of razor wire, thick as a man's thumb, glittered under the cold glare of lumen globes. And everywhere guns. Lascanon emplacement stared blindly at the sky from within reinforced redoubts. Heavy bolter nests, squat and menacing, covered every approach. It was a meat grinder designed on a scale that defied sanity, and we were the meat. Our transport, a lumbering chimera, rumbled to a halt in the shadow of one of the primary bastions, its armored ramp hissing open to reveal our new home. The air was different here, thicker, charged with a palpable tension. We scrambled out, boots sinking into the thick mud that was a slurry of churned soil, leaked lubricants, and human waste. We were herded by shouting sergeants into a forward trench line, the walls of earth and sandbags rising high above our heads, offering the illusion of safety. It was there I saw him, a god in golden armor. He stood on the parapet of the bastion above us, silhouetted against the bruised sky. A space marine of the Imperial Fists, the sons of Dawn, the Praetorians of Terra. He was a giant, his ceramite power armor making him twice the width of a normal man. A bolt gun, a weapon of legend, was mag-locked to his thigh. He held no weapon in his hands, only a pair of macro binoculars that he raised to his helmet's impassive faceplate, surveying the wasteland beyond our lines. He moved with an economy and grace that was terrifying, every line of his body, radiating a certainty and power that was utterly inhuman. We were rats in a trench, scurrying at his feet. He was a hawk on a cliff waiting for the storm. The gulf between us was more than just flesh and blood. It was a chasm of purpose of creation itself. He was made for this. We were just here to die. He never once looked down at us. We were beneath his notice part of the terrain he was sworn to defend. And then the storm broke. It began not with a bang, but with a whisper. A high, thin whistle that grew in pitch until it was a physical pressure against the eardrums. We all ducked a primal, useless instinct. The first shell from orbit struck 10 kilometers away on the no-man's land before the wall. We did not see the explosion, but we felt it. It was not a tremor through the ground. It was a concussion that punched the air from your lungs. The entire world seemed to lurch sideways for a second. Before that first shockwave had even passed, the sky began to rip apart. The bombardment was not a sequence of explosions. It was a single sustained cataclysm. Millions of tons of ordnance fired from the traitor fleet in high orbit rained down upon the defensive lines. The sky turned into a strobing, incandescent ceiling of fire and flak. The noise was absolute, a physical entity that hammered at you, shook the fillings in your teeth, and vibrated deep within your bones. It was impossible to think, impossible to speak. You learned in those first few minutes to read the symphony of destruction. The deep guttural crump of the enemy's siege cannons, the sharp whip-crack of the loyalist batteries answering from behind us, and the horrifying descending scream of the shells that were coming for you, the ones that ended not with a bang, but with a sudden violent cessation of everything. You could feel the near misses as waves of pressure that tried to peel the skin from your bones. The ground became a living thing, bucking and heaving like a dying beast. Dust and debris rained down constantly, making it impossible to see more than a few meters in any direction. This went on for hours. It felt like an eternity. We huddled at the bottom of the trench heads, bowed, trying to make ourselves small, as if we could somehow hide from the wrath of the heavens. Men wept, men prayed, men simply stared into nothing, their minds already shattered. Just when it seemed the universe could not possibly contain any more noise, a new sound began to weave itself into the cacophony. A high-pitched, ululating cry, a sound of millions of throats screaming in unison, not in pain, but in ecstatic fervor. The bombardment shifted, lifting from the forward trenches and moving deeper towards the bastions behind us. First wave. On the line. On the line, our sergeant screamed, his voice barely a rasp against the thunder. I risked a glance over the parapet. What I saw would be burned into my nightmares forever. The wasteland which had been empty moments before was now a moving sea of humanity. Cultists, millions of them. They poured from newly excavated tunnels and crashed drop pods, a tide of ragged flesh, armed with autoguns, chain knives, and crude farming implements. They were the dregs of the galaxy, driven mad by devotion to the ruinous powers. They surged forward with no thought for their own survival, their faces contorted in masks of insane joy. Fire at will, the order came. The entire wall erupted in a storm of las fire. Heavy bolters opened up their deep, rhythmic chugging, adding a bass note to the orchestra of death. The first ranks of the cultist horde were vaporized, torn apart, scythed down in their thousands. But they did not stop. They simply ran over the bodies of their own fallen, a carpet of dead and dying that smoothed their path to our guns. This wasn't a battle. It was pest control. It was the act of stamping on an anthill, and finding the ants just kept coming. A group of them, their bodies painted with blasphemous symbols, reached our section of the trench. They swarmed over the top, their eyes wide and bloodshot. I raised my lasgun, the weapon feeling clumsy and alien in my shaking hands. A man, his face a mess of ritual scars and filed teeth, lunged at me with a rusted axe. I fired. The red beam of light struck him in the chest. There was a sizzle, the smell of cooked meat and burnt cloth. He looked down at the smoking hole in his torso, then back up at me. He had a look of profound surprise on his face. Then he crumpled, falling into the trench at my feet. The world went silent. I could no longer hear the explosions, the screams, the gunfire. I could only hear the blood pounding in my ears. I stared down at the man I had just killed. He was young, not much older than me. His eyes were open, staring at the hateful sky. I had taken his life, a single insignificant life in a war of billions. My stomach heaved. I turned, leaned against the trench wall, and vomited the tasteless nutrient paste I had eaten for breakfast. The acrid taste of my own bile mixed with the dust of Terra. This was victory. This was glory. It tasted like ash and regret. The initial assault broke, but it was not a victory. It was merely a pause. The sea of fanatics had receded, leaving behind a breakwater of corpses that stretched to the horizon. The hours that followed the fighting were in some ways worse than the battle itself. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a hollow ache in the soul. This was when the reality of our new existence truly set in. Life in the trenches of the Neptune Wall was a monotonous cycle of misery punctuated by moments of sheer terror. Our world shrank to the narrow confines of the trench. The sky, a sliver of bruised grey above, was the domain of death. The ground beneath our feet was a thick, sucking morass of mud, blood, and filth. It clung to our boots, our clothes, our very skin, a constant chilling embrace. We slept when we could in hastily dug alcoves in the trench wall, our bodies contorted against the damp earth. Sleep was never a release. It was a shallow, fitful state, haunted by the echoes of explosions and the silent screams of the men we had killed. Every snap of a support beam, every scuttling of a rat in the dark, was enough to send a jolt of ice through your veins. Sustenance was a grey, gelatinous paste scooped from grooved trays. It was called corpse starch by the cynical veterans, a joke that held a horrifying kernel of truth. It was tasteless, textureless, but it kept you alive. We washed it down with water that tasted faintly of the chemicals used to purify it, and the metal of the canteen it was stored in. It was a life stripped of all comfort, all dignity. We were no longer men. We were components in a defensive machine, our only function to hold a position and expend ammunition. It was in this suffocating reality that we clung to the only thing we had left each other. The bonds forged in the gang warrens of Chthoniya were all that kept the madness at bay. We shared our meager rations, our last drops of water, and the dark, bitter humor that was the soldier's only shield. Jax was the heart of that shield for me. Even here in this terrestrial hell, he could find a reason to flash that crooked grin. One day, a period of time, marked only by a slight lessening of the gloom, we were huddled together on a firing step, trying to clean the mud from our laser guns. The air was still heavy with the stench of the dead piled up 100 meters away. "Remember that slop they served at the Scythehead Gangers' mess?" He murmured, his voice a low rasp. Tasted like sump oil and despair. I grunted, not looking up from my weapon. Still better than this. "Nah," he chuckled. "At least this stuff doesn't fight back." He nudged me with his elbow. "First thing we do when we get off this rock, Olin. Find a bar that serves real Chthonian ale, the kind that strips the paint off a chimera." I allowed myself a small smile. "You'll be lucky to find a bar that's still standing. Always the optimist," he said, shaking his head. He shifted his position, raising his head just slightly to peer through a firing slit in the sandbags. "Can't see a damn thing in this." Emperor's breath. It was not an order. It was not a scream. It was a soft, wet cough. I looked over. Jax was sliding down the trench wall, his helmet askew. There was a neat, perfectly round hole drilled through the plasteel just above his left eye. A thin trickle of dark blood and grey matter was leaking from it. His eyes were wide, but they were already vacant. The crooked smile was still on his lips, frozen there, a final cruel joke. The sound of the shot arrived a second later, a sharp hypersonic crack that was instantly swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the battlefield. An Alpha Legion sniper. a ghost miles away who had just extinguished my friend's life with a squeeze of a trigger. I stared. The universe had collapsed to that single impossible image. Jax, my friend, the one who spoke of a future with ale and laughter, was a lump of cooling meat in the mud. There had been no glory, no heroic charge, no defiant last stand. Just a whisper of sound and a sudden meaningless end. He had died for the crime of raising his head 2 inches too high. Something inside me broke. The fear that had been my constant companion since landing on Terra was burned away, replaced by something new, something hard and cold and heavy. It was hatred, pure, undiluted, and intensely personal. I was no longer fighting for the Emperor, or for Terra, or for some abstract notion of loyalty. I was fighting because somewhere out there in that grey wasteland was the man who had killed Jax. And I wanted to kill him. I wanted to kill them all. I picked up my lasgun, my knuckles white. The mud and the blood no longer felt like a prison. They felt like home. The cultist wave had been a force of nature, a mindless, screaming hurricane of flesh. The attack of the Iron Warriors was something far worse. It was the patient, methodical work of a master butcher. They were the Iveth Legion, the siege breakers, and the Neptune Wall was not an obstacle to them. It was a problem in applied ballistics, a complex equation they intended to solve with overwhelming firepower. Their preliminary bombardment was nothing like the indiscriminate orbital shelling we had endured before. This was a targeted clinical deconstruction of our defenses. It began with single-ranging shots. A lone shell would scream down and detonate against a bastion far to our left, followed by an unnerving silence. Minutes later, another would strike slightly closer, its impact point adjusted by an unseen malevolent intelligence. It was a conversation being held in the language of high explosives, and we were trapped in the middle of it. Then, once they had our measure, the true symphony began. There was a rhythm to it, a terrible percussive cadence. Whole batteries of traitor artillery would fire in perfect unison. You would hear the distant collective cough of their guns, a sound that rolled across the wasteland like low thunder. Then came the agonizing wait seconds, stretching into an eternity, as dozens of shells arced through the sky. The final deafening crescendo was not one explosion, but a series of overlapping detonations that hammered the same fortified position again and again, peeling away its armor, shattering its rock-crete heart, and silencing the guns within. They didn't just destroy our bunkers, they pulverized them, reducing them to craters of smoking rubble one by one. We huddled in our trench, listening to the fortress die around us, praying that our section wasn't next on the list. When the ground assault began, it was with the same cold, inexorable geometry. They advanced not with frenzied screams, but in a grim, silent tide of gunmetal grey and tarnished iron. The legionaries of the Iveth marched behind monstrous siege shields, their disciplined volleys of bolt gun fire sweeping the parapets, forcing us to keep our heads down. They were a moving wall of death, utterly devoid of the cultists' manic energy, and that made them infinitely more terrifying. It was during a brief lull in the shelling that I saw the thing that broke my understanding of the universe. It lumbered out of the smoke and dust, a grotesque parody of a space marine. It was huge even for one of the Astartes, its armor warped and swollen, fused with its flesh in a way that defied nature. Cables and pistons snaked through tumorous growths of muscle, and its face was a molten mask of rage and agony. It was an obliterator. We poured lass fire into it. The red beam sizzled and spattered against its hideously mutated armor, leaving scorch marks but doing no real damage. It ignored us as a leviathan ignores krill. It raised its arms, and I watched in nauseated disbelief as they began to change. Flesh and metal writhed, bone cracked and reformed, and the barrels of a dozen different weapons grew from its limbs like metallic cancers. A multi-melter, a plasma cannon, twin-linked bolters, they all emerged from the bubbling cauldron of its body, A platoon of guardsmen from a neighboring regiment, the Cadian 92nd, chose that moment to mount a countercharge, their faith overriding their fear. They were brave, disciplined, and utterly doomed. The Obliterator unleashed its full arsenal. A torrent of plasma, superheated gas, and explosive bolts erupted from its arms. The Cadians didn't even have time to scream. One moment they were a charging line of 40 men. The next they were just a cloud of vaporized, blood-molten flak armor and charred bone fragments. The creature stood impassively in the epicenter of the carnage it had created, its weapon limbs still smoking. My fear shifted then. It ceased to be the simple animal fear of death. It became a deeper, more profound horror, the terror of a soul confronted with something that was fundamentally, blasphemously wrong. The end of our position came not long after. A coordinated barrage from a dozen Vindicator siege tanks struck the bastion directly behind our trench line. The ancient rockcrete, already stressed by hours of shelling, finally gave way. There was a sound like the world groaning in agony, a deep grinding roar of collapsing stone and screeching tortured metal. The ground beneath us heaved violently, and a vast section of the wall, hundreds of meters long, simply slid into ruin, taking trench lines, bunkers, and thousands of men with it. Panic, absolute and undeniable, shattered our discipline. The line was broken. Orders were screamed, but never heard over the din. It was a full-scale rout. Fall back. Fall back to the Gorgon bar, our sergeant yelled, his face pale with dust and terror, before he was cut down by a burst of bolter fire that tore him in half. We ran. There was no thought, only the instinct to escape the collapsing fortress and the relentless advance of the iron-clad monsters behind us. The air was a choking fog of dust and promethium smoke. Explosions threw up fountains of earth and shrapnel. I ran alongside Jax's replacement, a kid from the Chthonian underhives named Kale, his face a mask of terror. We scrambled through a ruined communication trench, the ground shaking with the tread of things I dared not look at. A shell, ours or theirs, I never knew, landed just behind us. The world dissolved into a flash of white light and a deafening roar. I felt myself lifted off my feet and thrown through the air. My head struck something hard, and the grim symphony of the siege of Terra faded into a silent, welcoming darkness. I awoke to the taste of blood and powdered rockcrete. My head throbbed with a dull, concussive rhythm, and every breath was a painful reminder of bruised ribs. For a long moment I lay there, half buried in rubble, staring up at a sky that was a churning canvas of smoke and distant fire. The all-consuming roar of the front line had faded to a constant grinding snarl. I was behind the battle now, lost in the guts of the dead fortress. Getting to my feet was an agony. My body screamed in protest, but the instinct for survival was a brutal taskmaster. I was alone. Kyle was gone. The rest of my squad were gone. All that remained was the wreckage of the Neptune wall, a labyrinth of shattered bunkers and collapsed trenches. I checked my laser gun. Miraculously, it was still functional, its power pack half full. Clinging to it like a holy relic, I began to stumble my way back, using the blazing spire of the distant Imperial Palace as my only guide. It took hours. I moved through a landscape of ghosts, past the dead and the dying, their groans a soft counterpoint to the thunder of the war. Eventually, the random pockets of resistance began to coalesce. I found other survivors, dazed and bleeding, all staggering in the same general direction. We were a river of the defeated flowing towards the next line of defense. We were eventually herded by stern-faced officers into a makeshift command post set up in the ruins of a basilica. It was there they separated us. The Chthonians were told to wait. There were only a dozen of us left from the 3 companies that had been assigned to that sector. We sat in a huddle, our faces masks of grime and exhaustion avoiding each other's eyes. Then the commissar came. He was the same one I'd seen earlier, his uniform still unnervingly clean. He was flanked by 2 hulking stormtroopers in crimson carapace armor. He did not offer us water or medical aid. He offered only suspicion. Regiment 18. He began, his voice cold and clipped, devoid of any emotion. Your section of the wall collapsed. The casualty reports are extensive, and yet you are here. He let the words hang in the air. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. Tell me, how is it that so many sons of Chthoniya found their way out of the slaughter when better men did not? A grizzled veteran named Boros, his arm in a bloody sling, spoke up. We were lucky, Commissar. We fought. We ran when the line broke, just like everyone else. The Commissar's eyes narrowed. Luck is a fickle thing, Guardsman. Loyalty is not. He took a step closer, his gaze sweeping over us, making my skin crawl. Your homeworld birthed the arch-traitor. His poison runs in the very rock of Chthoniya. You must understand that your presence here is a complication. Your every action is under scrutiny. We must be certain that the taint of the father does not manifest in the sons. The insult was as sharp as a bayonet twisting in the gut. We had bled and died on that wall. I had watched my friend's life get snuffed out. And here we were being treated not as soldiers, but as potential traitors, our sacrifice measured against our cursed place of birth. We were dismissed without another word left to stew in a bitter, impotent rage. We were being issued new power packs for our rifles when it happened. A guardsman, his uniform cleaner than ours, his accent. The clipped formal tone of Ultramar sneered as he walked past. Make sure you aim them the right way, traitor sons, he said just loud enough for us to hear. Wouldn't want you getting confused about who the enemy is. Something in me snapped. The grief for Jax, the terror of the obliterator, the humiliation from the Commissar, it all boiled over. I lunged at him, shoving him hard against a stack of crates. Say that again. I snarled my voice, a guttural rasp I didn't recognize. The Ultramarian, bigger than me and unblooded, shoved me back. The truth hurts. You stink of the same hive scum as Horus himself. Why the Emperor ever trusted your kind is beyond me. We died on that wall, the same as your blue-blooded brothers, Boros shouted, stepping up beside me. Other Chthonians gathered around, their faces dark with fury. Other soldiers started to form a circle, the schism in our ranks becoming a physical reality. We were no longer just soldiers of the Imperium. We were Chthonians, Ultramarians, Cadians, Catarsians, and in the heart of the siege we were turning on each other. A White Scars officer, his face a web of ritual scars, intervened before it could come to blows. He pushed us apart with the flat of his power sword, his voice a low growl. The enemy is out there, he hissed, pointing a gauntleted finger towards the thunder of the front. Save your anger for them, or I will find a use for it myself. The crowd dispersed, but the poison remained. I walked away, my hands shaking with rage. We had survived the Iron Warriors, but we had been wounded by our own. I looked at the faces of my fellow Chthonians. The suspicion had solidified us, but it had also isolated us. We were alone, a tiny, hated island in a sea of defenders fighting a war on two fronts. There was no rest. We were given fresh power packs, a meager ration of water, and then herded onto armored transports before the blood on our fatigues had even dried. The Chthonian headhunters, or what was left of us, were being redeployed. Our new destination was a name whispered with a mix of awe and dread, the Lion's Gate spaceport. If the palace was the heart of Terra, the Lion's Gate was its primary artery, and the traitors wanted to sever it. The scale of the place was inhuman. We disembarked into a cavernous departure hall that could have contained a dozen hive slums. The vaulted ceiling kilometers above was a web of shattered glass and twisted girders, showing the angry, smoke-filled sky. Starfaring vessels, grand liners that had once carried millions between worlds, lay wrecked on the tarmac outside, their hulls breached and burning. The fighting here was different from the trench warfare at the wall. It was a chaotic, three-dimensional battle, fought through sprawling terminals, baggage handling systems turned into deadly mazes, and across vast open plazas littered with makeshift barricades of luggage carts and overturned statuary. We were assigned to hold a customs checkpoint, a pathetic line of desks and conveyor belts fortified with sandbags. The silence between firefights was more unnerving than the noise. It was a dead silence, heavy with the ghosts of a billion journeys, now just a tomb waiting for its next occupants. Then the silence broke. It was not the thunder of artillery this time. It was a global bestial roar, the sound of a legion of madmen baying for blood. The World Eaters had come. They didn't use tactics or cover. They were a torrent of frenzied violence, a wave of blood-splattered white and blue armor that crashed against our lines. They came screaming chain axes, revving with a hungry snarl that tore at the nerves. The battle devolved instantly into a series of brutal, intimate struggles for survival. Lasfear flashed in the gloom of the terminal, reflecting off the polished marble floors, now slick with blood. The air filled with the shriek of monomolecular teeth chewing through flak armor and flesh. We were pushed back, our firing line dissolving into desperate pockets of resistance. I found myself separated again, fighting back-to-back with Boros and 2 other Chthonians in a cramped security office. A blast door buckled and was torn from its hinges. A World Eater filled the doorway. He was a vision from hell, his armor festooned with skulls, his bare head a mask of snarling rage cables and tubes pumping chemical stimulants directly into his brain. He leveled a bolt pistol and blew the head off the man next to me in a spray of red mist. Boros charged him a Chthonian curse on his lips, his bayonet useless against ceramite. The World Eater swatted him aside with a contemptuous backhand, the impact shattering Boros's ribcage. Then he turned his gaze on me. Those eyes, they were not the eyes of a soldier. They were the eyes of a predator, utterly insane, seeing me as nothing more than meat. He raised his chain axe, its teeth whining as they accelerated. My laser gun was empty. My life was measured in the last 2 seconds it would take for that axe to fall. I closed my eyes. A new sound cut through the din, a sharp, piercing cry like a hunting hawk. A blur of motion, a streak of crimson and gold slammed into the World Eater. A blood angel. He had descended from a gantry above his jump pack, flaring. He was as beautiful as the World Eater was grotesque, his armor the color of arterial blood, his face angelic framed by a mane of blonde hair. The 2 Astartes collided. It was not a fight, it was an execution. The Blood Angel moved with a liquid grace that defied his size. His chainsword, the Angel's Talon, sang a song of pure, righteous fury. He parried the clumsy swing of the chain axe, spun inside the Berserker's guard, and disemboweled him in a single perfect motion. The World Eater dropped to his knees, looking down at his own innards, spilling onto the floor, a look of confused shock on his face, before the Blood Angel decapitated him with a final merciful stroke. I let out a breath. I didn't know I was holding my legs giving way. I owed this golden-haired angel my life. But he wasn't finished. Something had broken behind his perfect features. A subtle shift, a darkening of his eyes. His angelic face twisted into a predatory snarl, his teeth elongating into fangs. He let out a guttural howl that was almost indistinguishable from the death screams of the World Eater he had just slain. He turned back to the corpse, his chainsword revving again, and began to hack and tear at the body, stamping and cutting with a frenzy that had nothing to do with warfare and everything to do with pure, unrestrained savagery. The Red Thirst. I had heard whispers of it, the fatal flaw in the Ixth Legion's blood. To see it in person was to see the abyss stare back. He was a savior and a monster, a god and a beast, all in the same perfect form. I scrambled backwards away from my rescuer, my heart hammering with a new and more complex kind of fear. He had saved me from the enemy, but he had shown me that the angels on our side were just as terrifying. In the endless war for Terra, perhaps there were no good men left, only different shades of monster. The fall of the Lion's Gate was a grievous blow. We were pushed back sector by sector, fighting a losing battle through the labyrinthine substructures of the spaceport. The war became a thing of darkness, and echoes fought in maintenance tunnels and cavernous cargo bays. But the World Eaters in their bloody-minded frenzy were eventually spent. They were replaced by a new, more insidious foe, the Emperor's children. Their arrival was heralded not by bestial roars, but by a discordant symphony. Music twisted and agonizingly beautiful blared from towering sonic weapons, the notes designed to liquefy organs and shatter stone. Their artillery was different too. The shells didn't just explode, they detonated with a soft, final hiss, releasing vast clouds of iridescent vapor and shimmering dust. After one such barrage, a fine pink powder began to drift down from the shattered ceilings, coating everything in a delicate, almost beautiful layer of glittering particles. It looked like toxic snowfall. There was no immediate violent effect. It simply settled, and as we breathed in the tainted air, the madness began to seep in. It started subtly. I saw a man from a Lucifer Black's regiment, a soldier famed for his iron discipline, suddenly drop his weapon and begin to weep uncontrollably, his body racked with great heaving sobs for a grief that had no name. A few meters away, one of my own Chthonian I knew only as Grent started to laugh. It wasn't a laugh of humor or relief. It was a high, giggling trill, the sound a child might make, and it didn't stop. He giggled as he reloaded his laser gun. He giggled as our sergeant slapped him across the face. He was still giggling when a stray round from a Noise Marine's weapon pulped his chest. The battlefield became a madhouse. Our own emotions turned against us, sharpened into weapons that were as deadly as any blade. I felt it too, a strange lightness in my head, a dangerous loosening of the tight knot of fear that had lived in my stomach for weeks. But it was when I was alone that the true assault began. While on sentry duty huddled behind a barricade of plasteel shipping containers, I started to hear the whispers. They weren't in my ears. They were inside my skull, woven so cleverly into my own thoughts that at first I thought they were mine. So tired they would begin a soft, sympathetic murmur. "You've fought so hard. No one can ask for more. Your gun is so heavy. You could just put it down. Just for a moment. Feel how light you'd be without it." I shook my head, gripping my laser gun tighter, the cool metal a reassuring anchor to reality. The whispers changed their tack. "They don't care about you, Olin. The commissar, the officers, the distant, silent emperor. You are just a number to them. Another body for the wall. But we see you. We know your name. We know you are afraid." I squeezed my eyes shut. "Get out of my head," I muttered the words, feeling thick and clumsy in my mouth. "Why die for this pile of rock?" the voice cooed, seductive and reasonable. "Horus offers freedom, a galaxy where the strong are not slaves to the weak. All you have to do is stop fighting. Lay down your weapon. Surrender is not an end. It is a beginning. It is peace." The most terrifying part was that it made a kind of sense. My resolve, worn thin by exhaustion and despair, was beginning to fray. What was I fighting for? A home I couldn't return to. A populace that hated me. A god who remained silent. What saved me was the screaming. It started in the command post we were guarding, a fortified HAB unit 20 meters away. It wasn't the scream of pain, but of rage and accusation. I crept to a shattered viewport and looked inside. It was a squad from the Jovian Grenadier, 10 men who had been holding the position for 2 days straight. The pink dust was thick in their enclosed space, and they were turning on each other. His eyes, look at his eyes. One of them shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at his sergeant. "They're shifting. He's not human." "You're the traitor!" The sergeant roared back, his own face a mask of paranoia. "I saw you whispering to the shadows. You're letting them in." A man in the corner began firing his laser gun wildly at the ceiling, yelling about insects crawling under his skin. It was a chain reaction of terror. The accusation of traitor and demon flew back and forth until the shouting was replaced by the staccato bark of lasfire and the heavier thump of a bolt pistol. I watched, frozen in horror, as the squad methodically exterminated itself in a whirlwind of paranoid violence. In less than a minute, 10 loyal soldiers of the Imperium lay dead, killed by their own brothers. I scrambled back from the viewport, my heart pounding against my ribs. My breath came in ragged gasps. This was the true face of the enemy. They didn't just want to conquer Terra, they wanted to curdle it, to sour the very souls of its defenders until we tore ourselves apart. The whispers in my head fell silent, their work done by proxy. They didn't need to convince me to surrender if they could make me kill my comrades, or my comrades kill me. The sanity of my own mind was now a battlefield, and I had no idea how much longer I could hold the line. Our retreat from the spaceport was not a retreat. It was a rout. We were broken, scattered remnants funneled back through kilometers of ruins towards the final desperate line of defense before the Sanctum Imperialis itself, the Gorgon Bar. This was no mere wall. It was a formidable bastion, an integral part of the palace's outer defenses, a masterpiece of Rogel Dawn's own design. To be sent here was to be told you were standing on the last patch of solid ground before the abyss. The character of the war changed again. The defenders here were different. Fighting alongside the grim remnants of various guard regiments were the armies of the Machine God. Legions of Skitari, the cyborg soldiers of the Adeptus Mechanicus, stood in silent, unwavering ranks. They were terrifying. More machine than man, their flesh was pale and atrophied. Where it was visible, the rest replaced with gleaming brass and iron. They moved with a jerky, unnatural precision, their heads snapping to track targets with inhuman speed. They did not speak in Gothic, but in bursts of binary cant, a stream of clicks and static that was as alien as any Xeno's tongue. We fought beside them, but not with them. They felt no fear, no despair, no hope. They were living weapons, their loyalty coded into their wetware, and their cold, logical presence was somehow more unnerving than the Fanatic's rage or the Astartes' fury. Our position was on a high parapet overlooking a plaza of shattered marble that had once been called the Helioporan Fields. Beyond it, the enemy was massing. And among them, walking through the lesser war machines like a god through a herd of beasts, was a Titan. A Reaver-class battle Titan of the Legio Mortis, the Death's Heads. It was a walking fortress, a demigod of destruction, draped in chains and blasphemous icons. Its every step was an earthquake. The deafening blast of its Gatling blaster could shred a Lehman Russ tank into scrap in seconds, and the scream of its laser blaster boiling the air was a sound that heralded pure annihilation. For a full day we could do nothing but watch as it systematically dismantled the Gorgon Bar's outer defenses. Our heavy weapons were like pea shooters against its void shields. We were insects huddled in our holes as two colossal gods wrestled for the fate of our world. A loyalist warlord Titan of the Legio Ignatum, the Fire Wasps, strode out from behind the palace walls to meet the challenge. The battle that followed was on a scale that shattered the senses. Weapons that could level cities were fired at point-blank range. The air crackled with energies that tore reality asunder. We could only watch the flashes of light and feel the world shake, praying that our God would prove stronger than theirs. And for a glorious, fleeting moment, it seemed it was. The warlord, heavily damaged but defiant, landed a direct hit with its volcano cannon. The beam of pure solar fury struck the Reaver in the chest, punching through its shields, its armor, and deep into its reactor core. A cheer went up along the wall, a raw, desperate sound of 1,000 throats. The traitor Titan shuddered, a mortal wound delivered to an immortal machine. Its war horn, which had been blaring a triumphant dirge, sputtered and died into a mournful wail. It staggered back, mortally wounded explosions, blossoming like hellish flowers all across its superstructure. Then it began to fall. It fell slowly, majestically, a dying mountain of adamantium and hate. And it was falling directly towards us. The cheer died in our throats, replaced by a collective gasp of horror. Brace was the only word I heard before the universe ended. The Titan's 4-million-ton chassis struck the Gorgon Bar. The kinetic impact alone was that of an extinction-level asteroid. The wall, a structure that had been designed to withstand orbital bombardment, simply ceased to exist. Then, a second later, its plasma reactor went critical. I did not see a flash. I was in the flash. The world became pure, white, silent heat. A wave of force, solid as a planet, picked me up and threw me backwards. I felt a succession of brutal impacts as I was slammed through rockcrete walls and twisted plasteel beams. Then came the weight. The colossal, suffocating, absolute weight of a kilometer of fortress collapsing on top of me. The white light vanished, replaced by a crushing, total darkness. Pain was the first thing to return. A sharp, searing agony in my leg, a dull, crushing pressure on my chest. I tried to breathe, but my lungs filled with thick, choking dust. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through me. I was buried alive, trapped. I tried to scream, but only a dry, rattling cough came out. I was entombed hundreds of meters beneath what was left of the wall. This is it, I thought. This is the end. Not a glorious death in battle, but a slow, lonely suffocation in the dark. The whispers came back then, not the seductive ones of the Emperor's children, but the darker whispers of my own despair. Just let go. It's over. No one is coming for you. Just sleep. I almost listened. It would have been so easy. But then I thought of Jax. I thought of the Commissar's sneer, the Ultramarion's contempt. I thought of the World Eater's axe and the Blood Angel's feral eyes. A spark of something hard and stubborn and ugly ignited in my chest. Rage. I would not die here. I would not give them the satisfaction. I began to dig. My left arm was pinned, but my right was free. I clawed at the rubble above me, my fingers raw and bloody. It was like trying to dig through solid rock. For every handful of dust and gravel I dislodged, another seemed to fall and take its place. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the darkness, the pain, and the slow, agonizing work. I pushed with my broken leg, screaming through clenched teeth as bone grated on bone. I shoved with my shoulders, dislodging a slab of rockcrete that had been crushing my chest. I was a worm, a maggot, fighting my way back to a world that probably didn't want me. After an eternity of effort, my fingers broke through. They met not resistance, but open air. A faint, hellish red light filtered through the gap. I clawed at the opening, widening it until I could finally drag my broken body through. I collapsed onto a slope of rubble, gasping in the smoke-filled air. I had escaped my tomb, but I had emerged into hell. The Gorgon Bar was gone. In its place was a vast, gaping breach in the palace's defenses, and through it the armies of the arch-traitor were pouring their victory banners held high against a sky of fire. We had lost. Hope was dead. With the Gorgon Bar breached, the war dissolved into a brutal street-by-street brawl for the outer precincts of the Imperial Palace. There were no more stable fronts, no trench lines, only a chaotic patchwork of barricades, strong points and kill zones established in the ruins of once majestic plazas and statuary gardens. The coherent structure of the Imperial war machine had fractured. We were no longer an army. We were isolated pockets of starving men fighting for our own desperate survival. The true enemy in those days was not the traitor legions, but our own logistical collapse. The main supply arteries had been severed and the reserves were running dry. The first casualty was our food. The nutrient paste, which we had once cursed for its blandness, became a memory of feasting. Now we were issued a thin, foul-smelling gruel once a day, a ladleful of watery broth with unidentifiable lumps floating in it. Hunger became a constant gnawing presence, a dull ache that hollowed out our insides and left us weak and irritable. Our uniforms hung loose on emaciated frames, our faces becoming gaunt, skull-like masks of dirt and exhaustion. Worse than the food was the scarcity of munitions. The bark of a lasgun, once the constant music of the war, became a measured, precious thing. Sergeants no longer yelled fire at will. They screamed controlled bursts, make every shot count. We learned the grim arithmetic of the battlefield. The life of an advancing cultist was not worth a full power pack. We were ordered to fix bayonets to use our rifles as pikes, to save our energy cells for the true threats, the armored traitors, who could only be stopped by concentrated fire. The most dehumanizing task was the scavenging. After every firefight, we were sent out to resupply from the bodies of the fallen. We moved among our dead comrades not to offer them last rites, but to strip them of their possessions. We pried lasguns from their death grips, pulled power packs from their webbing, took their grenades, their canteens, even the boots from their feet if they were in better condition than our own. Any sense of ceremony or respect for the dead was a luxury we could no longer afford. The bodies of our brothers were just another resource to be exploited, a final grim service they could render to the throne. We worked in silence, our faces numb, averting our eyes from the dead, glassy stares of men whose names we had known yesterday. As our world decayed, the very environment began to turn on us. A foul, sickly sweet stench began to rise from the sewer grates, and drainage pipes, a smell of rot and decay that clung to the back of the throat. The water in the conduits turned brackish and foul. Then they came. They were nurglings, the demonic spawn of the plague god. They were not warriors. They were a pestilence given form. Small, green, pot-bellied creatures with malicious, giggling faces, they swarmed up from the darkness below ground. They moved in chittering, disgusting tides, overwhelming sentries through sheer weight of numbers. To fight them was a nauseating affair. A lasbolt would cause them to burst in a spray of filth and contagion. Their claws and teeth were not sharp, but they were coated in every disease imaginable. A single scratch meant a slow, agonizing death from a fever that boiled your blood and rotted your flesh from the inside out. We spent an entire cycle fighting a wave of them in a subterranean transit nexus, the air thick with their foul giggling, and our own curses, our bayonets and rifle butts slick with their putrid insides. The pressure from the hunger, the endless fighting, the psychological torment, the sheer filth was becoming unbearable. Men were breaking. I saw the finality of that breakage in a quiet moment behind a barricade of fallen statuary. We were waiting for the next attack. I was watching a young soldier from a Praetorian regiment, a kid who couldn't have been more than 17. He was sitting with his back to the marble flank of a headless griffin, his movements calm and deliberate. He pulled a battered picked slate from his pocket and looked at it for a long moment. I caught a glimpse of a woman and a small child smiling out from the cracked screen. He didn't weep. His face was a mask of utter tranquility, as if he had finally solved a complex problem that had been vexing him. Slowly, methodically, he placed the picked slate back in his tunic, took his lasgun, and pressed the muzzle up under his chin. No one shouted. No one tried to stop him. We all just watched, paralyzed by a grim, unspoken understanding. He pulled the trigger. There was a sharp crack, a brief flash of red light, and he slumped sideways. His war was over. A silence fell over our small group. No one spoke. The sergeant, a man with a face like a stone carving, simply walked over, nudged the body with his boot to make sure it was done, and then began unbuckling the dead boy's web gear. His power pack is full, was all he said. I felt nothing. Not shock, not pity, not even sadness. Just a profound, chilling emptiness. The enemy hadn't even needed a bullet to kill that boy. They had simply made his life so unbearable that death seemed like a reasonable escape. And the worst part was, in that moment I completely understood. In the grinding attrition of the palace's outer rings, the concept of a coherent regiment had ceased to exist. We Chthonians were a pack of strays, a few dozen survivors, who clung together out of shared origin and mutual mistrust from the other Imperial units. We were commanded by a hard-bitten sergeant from the Mordian Iron Guard, a man who saw us not as soldiers, but as potential insubordinates to be managed. But the true authority, the shadow that loomed over us all, was the commissar. He had attached himself to our remnant, his presence a constant chilling reminder of our perceived impurity. The breaking point came for a soldier named Liren. He was young even by guard standards, his face still holding the soft edges of boyhood beneath the grime and stubble. He had been quiet since the Gorgon bar, his eyes holding a haunted, distant look. We had all seen it. It was the look of a mind that had seen too much, a spirit that had been stretched to its absolute limit. His attempt to desert was not a calculated act of betrayal. It was the simple, desperate flight of a broken animal. During a lull in the fighting under the cover of a thick chemical fog, he simply dropped his lasgun, turned his back on the war, and started walking away into the ruins. He didn't run. He just walked a shambling, aimless gait as if in a trance. He was trying to leave hell by simply walking out the front door. He didn't get 50 meters. The commissar seemed to melt out of the fog, his 2 crimson-armored stormtroopers flanking him. They brought Liren down with a tackle that was brutally efficient. They dragged him back, his arms pinned behind him, his face a blank mask of resignation. He didn't struggle. He didn't even seem to see us as he was thrown to the ground in the center of our makeshift command post. The commissar let him lie there for a moment, a piece of filth to be examined. Then he ordered us to assemble. We were pulled from our posts, from our attempts at sleep, from our grim scavenging, and forced to form a semicircle around the condemned boy. "Behold, soldiers of the Imperium!" The commissar's voice boomed, cutting through the damp air. It was the same man who had interrogated us, his face an unyielding mask of righteousness. "You see before you the consequence of spiritual weakness. This Chthonian cur, this spawn of a traitor's world, has forgotten his oath. He paced before us, his polished boots immaculate even in this squalor. He has sought to place his own wretched, insignificant life above the glorious will of the Emperor. He has mistaken fear for reason. He has allowed the taint in his blood to manifest as cowardice." I looked at Liren trembling on the ground. I saw no taint, no cowardice. I saw a boy who had been fed into a meat grinder for weeks, who had seen his friends atomized, who had breathed in the dust of madness and fought off demonic filth in the dark. I saw a human being who had simply broken. The commissar stopped his pacing and stared directly at me, his eyes like chips of obsidian. "There is only one cure for such a disease," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "It is the fire of redemption. The Emperor demands discipline. He demands sacrifice. This one's life is forfeit, but his death will serve a greater purpose. It will be a lesson, a reminder to you all that your lives are not your own. They are the coin with which victory is purchased." He drew his bolt pistol. The sound of the weapon being cocked was unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Liren looked up, not at the commissar, but at us, his eyes pleading. He wasn't asking for help. He was asking for understanding. "Let his death serve as a warning," the commissar declared, aiming the monstrous handgun at Liren's head. "The only justice in wartime is swift and absolute." He fired. The bolt pistol's roar was deafening, a brutal clap of thunder in our confined space. Liren's head didn't just break, it detonated in a wet, crimson explosion of bone and brain matter. His body convulsed once, and then lay still. The commissar holstered his weapon, his uniform spattered with the evidence of his justice. "Return to your posts," he ordered, his voice flat, as if he had just completed a mundane administrative task. "Be strengthened by the Emperor's judgment." We dispersed in silence, filing past what was left of Liren. No one looked down. I felt a coldness spread through my chest, extinguishing the last embers of rage and grief. In that moment, I finally understood. We were not the thin, grey line holding back the darkness. We were not heroes. We were ammunition. We were fuel for the fire. Our lives had no value beyond our immediate utility. To the enemy, we were corpses waiting to be made. To our commanders, we were numbers on a slate, tools that would be used until we broke, and then discarded with utter indifference. My survival was not the goal. Only the survival of the machine mattered, and I was just one of its million dying parts. We thought we had seen the worst the universe had to offer. We had faced the industrial slaughter of the Iron Warriors and the depraved madness of the Emperor's children. We had endured hunger disease and the utter collapse of hope. We were wrong. We had not yet faced hell itself. It began with the air. It grew thick and heavy, charged with a static that made the hair on our arms stand up. The sky, a permanent smear of brown and grey, began to bleed at the edges, swirling with colours that had no name colours that hurt the eyes to see. Distant screams sounded both miles away and right beside my ear. The gravity felt wrong, shifting and unreliable, making the simple act of standing feel like balancing on the deck of a storm-tossed ship. The laws of physics were being rewritten by a mad god, and we were trapped on the page. Then reality tore. It happened in the middle of a blasted plaza 100 meters from our position. There was no explosion, no warning. The air simply split apart like old cloth opening a wound in the world. It was not a hole leading to blackness. It was a gateway into a roiling, incandescent, blood-red sea of pure chaos. It was a vortex of impossible geometry that seemed to writhe and pulse with a malevolent life of its own. Looking at it was like staring into the heart of a seizure, a vision so blasphemous that my mind recoiled, trying to reject what my eyes were seeing. From this wound in space they came. They did not march or charge. They spilled forth a torrent of living hatred. They were bloodletters, the foot soldiers of the blood god Khorne. They were tall, sinewy creatures of brass-colored skin and knotted muscle, their faces locked in permanent snarling grimaces crowned with vicious horns. In their hands they carried jagged black swords that seemed to drink the light and weep blood. They moved with a horrifying, loping gait, their cloven hooves striking sparks from the broken stone. This was not an army. An army has a purpose, a strategy. This was a natural disaster made manifest. They were a tsunami of murder, a firestorm of slaughter. They crashed into the battlefield and simply began to kill. They made no distinction between loyalist and traitor. A squad of Sons of Horus legionaries who had been advancing on our position turned to face this new threat and were annihilated in a heartbeat, their power armor torn open like tin cans. The demons roared a sound that was not a battle cry, but the pure, undiluted expression of the will to kill. Our pathetic barricade was their next obstacle. Our sergeant screamed orders that were lost in the demonic din. We fired our las beams, tracing lines of defiant red against the tide of brass and blood. The shots sizzled against their unnatural hides, but they did not slow. They hit our line with the force of a freight train. The last men of the Thonian headhunters died in a storm of hacking blades and guttural roars. I saw Boros, the old veteran, get his arm severed at the shoulder before a hellblade gutted him. I saw a young trooper decapitated, his head flying through the air, its expression of terror frozen for a moment before it hit the ground. A demon lunged for me, its eyes burning like coals. I fired my laser gun on instinct, the beam striking it in the chest. It staggered, roared in fury, and then a stray mortar shell whose I'll never know landed nearby. The blast threw me sideways into a deep shell crater, which was already half filled with the bodies of guardsmen from an earlier engagement. I landed in a wet, tangled mess of limbs and broken flak armor. The demon that had been about to kill me was momentarily distracted, turning its rage upon another hapless soldier. My leg was twisted beneath me, the pain excruciating, but my mind was screaming one single overriding command hide. I clawed at the bodies around me, pulling them over myself. A dead Mordian with a missing face, a Cadian whose chest was a crater of gore. I buried myself under their cooling flesh in the slick coppery mud of their pooled blood until I was completely covered. I lay there in the stinking claustrophobic darkness my breath held until my lungs burned, and I listened. I listened to the wet tearing sounds as the last of my comrades were butchered. I heard screams that were cut short with horrifying gurgles. I heard the triumphant, blood-curdling roars of the demons as they celebrated their slaughter. I could hear their hooves stamping the earth just meters from my hiding place, could smell their foul metallic scent seeping down through the pile of corpses. I lay there, trembling, bathed in the blood of my friends, listening to the sounds of hell. For the first time since I was a child, I prayed. I prayed to the Emperor, my lips moving silently in the dark, forming the words of the litany of protection. I prayed for deliverance, for strength, for a swift death, for anything. But the words were hollow, meaningless. They were just sounds I had been taught a child's charm against the dark. And the darkness did not care. The Emperor was not listening. Eventually, the sounds of slaughter moved on as the demonic tide washed deeper into the palace grounds. A long, long time later, I clawed my way out. I was soaked in blood, none of it my own. I stood shakily in the crater looking out at a world that no longer made sense. The air shimmered. The ground was littered with the remains of what had once been men. I looked down at the faded aquila stamped on my flak armor. I felt nothing for it. No loyalty, no faith, no hope. That part of me had died in the dark, under the weight of the dead, listening to the laughter of demons. The prayers had been scoured from my soul. There was no God on his golden throne. There was only the war. And me. I don't know how long I walked before I found other loyalists, hours or maybe a day. Time had lost its shape. I was eventually absorbed into a mixed platoon of survivors, a motley collection of soldiers from a dozen different shattered regiments. No one asked my name or my unit. They just looked at the blood that soaked me from head to toe, handed me 2 fresh power packs, and pointed me towards a section of a barricade. I was another warm body to point a gun, and that was all that mattered. Something was different inside me. The demon attack had scoured me clean. The constant gnawing fear that had been my companion since I first set foot on Terra was gone. The burning hatred that had taken root after Jax's death was gone. The flickering, desperate hope that had somehow endured through it all was gone. All of it had been replaced by a profound and absolute silence. The war still raged around me, a cacophony of explosions, gunfire, and screams, but it all seemed distant now, like a storm happening on the other side of a thick wall of glass. Inside my head there was only a calm, cold, empty quiet. This new emptiness made me a better soldier. I fought with a detached mechanical efficiency that I had never possessed before. When a traitor marine in the livery of the word-bearers vaulted over our barricade, I didn't feel the spike of terror I once would have. I simply registered the threat, calculated the trajectory, and fired 3 controlled shots into the weak point of his helmet's neck seal. He fell without a sound. I felt no triumph, no relief. I had simply identified a problem and solved it. My actions were no longer driven by emotion, but by a simple, brutal logic of survival. Take cover. Acquire target. Eliminate threat. Conserve ammunition. Repeat. I had become a machine made of meat. I killed with the same emotionless finality that a farmer uses to slaughter livestock. I ate the disgusting rations without tasting them. I slept in short, dreamless bursts, waking instantly without the groggy disorientation of before. My humanity had been a liability, a weakness that the war had surgically excised. I was now perfectly adapted to my environment. I was a monster made for a world of monsters. One cycle, a rare lull fell over our sector. In the quiet, we heard the scream of atmospheric entry. It wasn't the sound of an incoming bombardment. It was a loyalist craft. A single storm bird flying a suicidal low-altitude run managed to break through the traitor blockade and land in a relatively secure plaza behind our lines. Its ramp lowered and fresh troops disembarked. They were from the Indigan Prefects, a regiment known for its parade ground discipline. Their uniforms were clean, their equipment new. They were young, their faces etched with a mixture of terror and grim determination. I saw in their eyes the same thing I must have had when I first landed, a belief that their sacrifice would mean something, a faith in the Emperor and the righteousness of their cause. They were children sent to fight in a war they couldn't possibly comprehend. The other veterans and I watched them form up, our faces grim and impassive. One of the new sergeants, his face flushed with zealous fervor, strode over to us. "Report," he barked at our officer. "What is the situation at the front?" Our officer, a gaunt-faced man from the Talon Desert Raiders, just stared at him for a long second before letting out a dry, rasping chuckle. "The situation," he said, "is that you are all dead. You just haven't been processed yet." The new sergeant bristled, but he had no reply. Because we all knew it was the truth. I looked at the fresh faces of the prefects, and I felt nothing. No pity, no camaraderie, no sense of reinforcement. I was looking at ghosts. I saw the clean lines of their uniforms and imagined them torn and blood-soaked. I saw their bright, determined eyes and imagined them wide and glassy in death. I could almost see their fates. That one, the tall one, would be vaporized by a plasma blast. The Vox operator would be taken out by a sniper. The heavy weapons team would be overrun in a charge. They were walking corpses, and their only remaining purpose was to buy a few more seconds for the rest of us walking corpses. I turned away from them. Their hope was an obscenity. Their faith was a lie. They were a message from a world that no longer existed, a world where things like courage and duty had meaning. That world was gone. There was only the silence within and the war without. And I was no longer a soldier fighting for a cause. I was just a survivor waiting for the end. The end began with a single system-wide Vox command, broadcast on all channels, cutting through the screams and the static. The voice was calm, resonant, and carried an authority that was absolute. It was the voice of a Primarch or something close to it. All surviving elements of the Solar Auxilia and Imperial Army are to execute Protocol Sanction Final. Disengage and fall back to the Eternity Wall. I repeat, all outer precincts are to be abandoned. Fall back to the Sanctum Imperialis. The order was both a relief and a death sentence. We had spent weeks and countless lives defending every meter of the palace's outer rings, trading blood for rubble. Now it was all being given up. This was it, the last stand. There was nowhere left to run. The retreat was a hellish fighting withdrawal. We scrambled back through the grand causeways and shattered plazas we had bled for the enemy hot on our heels. They sensed the final kill and pressed their advantage, their numbers seeming endless. Our retreat was covered by the stoic remnants of the Legiones Astartes' grim imperial fists, white-armored white scars on growling bikes, and the terrifying silent shadows of the Raven Guard. They were the breakwater against which the traitor tide crashed, buying us the mortal chaff precious minutes to escape. I ran my movements economical, my mind a quiet, cold calculator of risk and survival. I no longer felt the panic of the rout from the Neptune Wall. I was simply a particle in a great river of broken soldiers flowing towards the last sanctuary. And then through the smoke I saw it. The Eternity Wall. It was not a wall. It was a cliff face of gleaming gold and adamantium, so tall that it seemed to hold up the tortured sky. Every surface was a tapestry of masterful engraving and statuary, yet bristled with weapon emplacements that could fell titans. It was a fortress built by a god, a perfect union of art and death. And at its base was the Eternity Gate, a colossal portal of layered auramite, large enough for a titan to walk through. It stood open, a glowing maw of safety, beckoning us in. It was there, holding the gate against the ravenous tide of traitors, that I saw them for the first time. The Adeptus Custodes, the 10,000, the Emperor's own companions. They were not like the Astartes. To compare them would be to compare a hunting hound to a wolf god. They were giants taller and broader than even the legionaries, clad in Baroque golden armor that was not merely war gear, but a work of art in itself. They moved with a liquid grace that was utterly transfixing, their guardian spears, massive pole arms with integrated bolters wielded not as crude weapons, but as extensions of their own perfect forms. There were perhaps 30 of them, holding the plaza before the gate, and they were holding it against hundreds of traitor marines, including the elite of the Sons of Horus. It was not a battle. It was a masterclass in slaughter. I watched one of them, his crimson plume flowing behind him, move through a squad of Justerin Terminators. He did not meet their charge with brutal force. He flowed around them, a dance of death. His spear parried a blow from a power axe spun and decapitated the Terminator in a single fluid motion. He fired the bolter in his weapon, punching a hole through the chest of another, then used the spear's butt to shatter the helmet of a third. 3 of the War Master's finest warriors dead in as many seconds, and the custodian had not taken a single step back. I stopped running, mesmerized by the spectacle. All my struggles, all my dirty, desperate fights for survival in the mud and the filth, seemed like a child's clumsy tantrum compared to this. We had held the line with numbers with desperation, with our own bodies stacked high as barricades. These golden demigods held it with pure, effortless, and beautiful violence. Their existence was a rebuke to my own. My entire war, my lost friends, my shattered soul, the sacrifices of millions of guardsmen. What was it all worth when one of these beings was worth 1,000 of us? Our struggle was not the main story. We were merely the background noise, the dirt under the fingernails of the real players in this game of gods. My survival felt not heroic, but statistically irrelevant. An officer shoved me forward. "Move, Euthonian dog. Don't just stand there." I stumbled on, moving past the golden giants and through the Eternity Gate. The sheer scale of the portal's interior was dizzying. I glanced back one last time. The custodians were beginning a slow, methodical retreat. Not one of them lost their movements, still as perfect and unhurried as they had been at the start. Then, with a groan that shook the foundations of Terra, the great gate began to close. It shut out the screams, the fire, and the war. We were inside. The last fortress. The final tomb. Inside the final bastion, the war reached a new crescendo of insanity. We, the mortal remnants of the Imperial army, were deployed along the lower battlements of the Eternity Wall, our task to repel the endless waves of cultists and beastmen who sought to scale the golden ramparts with crude ladders and grappling hooks. Above us on the higher tiers, the Legiones Astartes and the Custodes fought a war of gods and monsters, their battles shaking the very foundations of the wall we stood upon. The empty silence in my soul had become my shield. I fought, I killed, I reloaded, I survived. It was all I knew. We had been holding a section near the base of the Eternity Gate for what felt like a lifetime when the sky above us changed. The perpetual smoky gloom was torn asunder by a descending comet of pure golden light. It was not a drop pod nor a fighter craft. It moved with an impossible, breathtaking grace. Then the light resolved into a form, a figure of divine perfection, flanked by 2 immense wings of the purest white. He landed on the parapet 100 meters above our position. He landed not with a crash of armor, but with the silent, weightless grace of a falling feather. It was Sanguinius, the great angel, the Primarch of the 8th Legion. He was real. He was not a figure from a stained glass window or a propaganda poster. He was a living, breathing being of such radiant beauty and power that it defied all reason. His golden armor shone with an inner light, and his face was a mask of sorrowful, angelic perfection. And from him a palpable aura rolled down the wall, washing over us. It was like the first warmth of a sun on a world that had known only freezing darkness. The cold, empty silence in my soul, the void that had been my only companion for so long, was suddenly shockingly filled with light. It was not a thought. It was a feeling, a pure, unreasoning surge of emotion that I had forgotten how to experience. It was hope. It was a sudden absolute certainty that we could not lose, that this radiant being, this golden demigod, would not allow it. The despair, the cynicism, the weariness, it was all burned away in an instant, replaced by a fierce, burning loyalty and a desire to be worthy of standing in his shadow. I felt tears tracking paths through the grime on my cheeks, and I was not ashamed. Around me, other hardened, half-dead veterans were weeping openly, their faces turned upwards towards the angel like flowers to the sun. As if drawn by his light, a new horror clawed its way onto the battlements. It was a creature of nightmare, a being of brass and knotted muscle, so vast it dwarfed even the Astartes. A bloodthirster, a greater demon of Khorne, its vast leathery wings blotting out the sky. It wielded a colossal axe dripping with gore in one hand and a fiery whip in the other, its monstrous canine face roaring a challenge that was a physical blow. Mortals near it simply died, their hearts bursting from sheer terror. Sanguinius did not hesitate. He did not call for aid. With a cry that was both beautiful and terrible, a sound of righteous fury, he launched himself into the air, his white wings beating against the smoke-filled sky. He met the demon in a clash that sent shockwaves across the battlements. It was a battle from the pages of mythology, a duel between an angel and a devil at the end of the world. The demon was a force of pure, brutal rage, its axe carving chunks out of the adamantium wall. The Primarch was a blur of golden light and white feathers, a whirlwind of graceful, deadly precision. He moved with a speed that the eye could barely follow his spear of Telesto, a needle of light against the monster's unholy bulk. I watched my lasgun forgotten in my hands, my mouth agape. I was a mite watching titans wrestle for the fate of creation. The Primarch was wounded, a black gash torn across his chest by the demon's whip, but his light did not diminish. He drove the bloodthirster back, his every blow perfect, his every parry flawless. Finally, with a climactic soaring cry, he plunged his spear deep into the demon's black heart. He lifted the colossal creature from its feet, held it aloft for a single breathtaking moment, and then with a surge of his own divine strength broke its back over his knee. The bloodthirster gave one last shuddering roar of disbelief before its physical form dissolved in a flash of foul red energy. Sanguinius stood alone on the parapet, his golden armor splattered with demonic ichor, his white wings spread wide against the fires of the siege. A single white feather dislodged in the fight drifted slowly down and landed near my feet. A roar of victory erupted from every loyalist throat along the wall, a sound of pure cathartic triumph. We had seen a god walk among us and cast down a devil. In that moment we were invincible. The hope he had ignited in me blazed into a bonfire. But as the cheers subsided and I looked up at the radiant, sorrowful figure, another feeling settled over me. It was not the despair of before. It was a calm, profound, and absolute acceptance. The sight had inspired me beyond words, but it had also shown me the final, undeniable truth of my own existence. This was his war. This was a war for the souls of Primarchs and the fate of the galaxy, a contest between angels and demons gods and their treacherous sons. I was nothing. My struggles, my pain, my survival, they were less than a footnote in this epic saga. I was not a hero. I was not even a soldier, not really. I was just a mortal man who had been granted the terrible privilege of witnessing the sublime. And that was enough. The victory of Sanguinius over the bloodthirster was a turning point. A wave of renewed fervor swept along the Eternity Wall. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the battle seemed to be turning in our favor. Emboldened by the Primarch's presence, the defenders fought with a fury that pushed the traitors back from the gate. The hope the angel had ignited in me was a fire in my veins. I fought alongside the others, no longer a hollow machine, but a true soldier of terror, my lasgun spitting defiance at the darkness. Then, just as the battle reached its most frenzied peak, a strange and sudden quiet fell. It was not a silence. It was a cessation. The constant overwhelming roar of artillery, the chugging of heavy bolters, the crackle of Lars fire, it all faltered as if a great hand had muffled the entire world. The traitor legions, who had been pressing their assault with suicidal determination, hesitated. They looked around, their expressions of rage and hate replaced by confusion. Even from our high perch, we could see the momentum of their attack bleed away into a universal, uncertain stillness. A deep, instinctual dread coiled in my gut. This was not the quiet of a coming victory. It was the held breath before the universe screams, and then it screamed. It was not a sound. Sound travels through the air, it strikes the eardrum. This came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a wave of pure psychic agony that washed over the planet, ignoring stone and steel and flesh, and struck directly at the soul. It was a pressure that built behind the eyes, a vibration that resonated in the very marrow of my bones. It was the concentrated grief of a billion souls crying out at once. It was the sound of a star dying. It was the feeling of a father's heart breaking as he is forced to strike down his most beloved son. I collapsed. Every soldier on the wall collapsed. Guardsmen, Astartes, even the golden-armored custodes fell to their knees, clutching their heads. A thick, hot stream of blood poured from my nose and ears. My eyes felt like they were boiling in their sockets as crimson tears tracked down my face. My mind was filled with an ocean of pain that was not my own. I felt the splintering of a god's bones, the tearing of a divine will, the extinguishing of the brightest light in the galaxy. It was a psychic cataclysm, a spiritual wound inflicted upon every living loyalist soul on Terra. We were not just hearing the Emperor's suffering. For one terrible infinite moment we were sharing in it. The scream, or the feeling, or whatever it was, lasted an eternity and a second. When it finally receded, it left behind a silence that was more profound and terrifying than the noise that had preceded it. It was the silence of a tomb, a hollow, aching void where faith used to be. I pushed myself onto my hands and knees, my body shaking uncontrollably. All around me, men were stirring, groaning, their faces streaked with their own blood. Some were not. Their minds or bodies had been too weak to withstand the psychic backlash, and they lay still, their lives snuffed out by a scream no one had heard. I staggered back to the parapet, my newfound hope utterly shattered, replaced by a grief so vast it felt like the planet's own. I looked out at the battlefield, and I saw the rout. The Sons of Horus were in a full-blown panic. The Iron Warriors, the unbreakable siege masters, were abandoning their meticulously constructed positions and fleeing. The word-bearers were on their knees, not in prayer, but in abject despair. The psychic shockwave that had crippled us had utterly broken them. Their god, their war master, the focus of their hateful crusade, had been defeated. The psychic backlash had severed their chain of command and their morale in a single devastating blow. They were running. They were scrambling over each other to get back to their drop pods and transports. The greatest siege in the history of mankind, the war that had consumed the galaxy, was ending. It was ending not in a final climactic battle, but in the panicked, terrified flight of a leaderless mob. We had won. The siege of Terra was over. No one cheered. There were no cries of victory. We, the survivors, the defenders of the throne, simply stood or knelt on the battlements, bleeding from our faces, and watched them run. There was no triumph in our hearts, only the cold, empty echo of that final, terrible scream, and the knowledge that our victory had cost us everything. The rout of the traitor host was not a swift affair. It took the better part of a day for the last of their retreating ships to burn their way into the void, harried by the guns of the phalanx and the vengeful ships of the fleet that had finally arrived. On the surface of Terra, the war ended as it had begun, with a slow, creeping silence. The thunder of the guns died away, replaced by the crackle of a billion fires and the low moan of a poisoned wind blowing across the plains of the dead. There were no new orders. The chain of command, shattered by the psychic scream, was slow to reform. We, the survivors, were left to ourselves, adrift in the immediate, shocking aftermath. I found myself walking down from the eternity wall, my steps unsteady, my mind, a hollow chamber echoing with that final spiritual shriek. I moved without purpose, a ghost, haunting the scenes of my own recent past. The landscape was a charnel house on a planetary scale. The sheer magnitude of the dead was impossible for the mind to process. They were not individual bodies anymore. They were a new, terrible geology. Mountains of corpses, loyalist and traitor, tangled together in a final, obscene embrace, formed ridges and valleys across the cratered earth. The broken hulks of tanks and knights were the gravestones. The colossal fallen chassis of the Legio Mortis Riva was a dark and twisted mountain on the horizon, a monument to the battle of gods that had doomed us all. The air was thick and cloying, a miasma of cooling blood, spent promethium, and the sweet, sickly stench of corruption. I was not the only one wandering this new, quiet hell. I saw the other survivors moving like shades through the smoke. An imperial fist, his yellow armor battered and scorched, knelt by the body of a fallen brother, his helmet held in his hands. He was not weeping. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were ancient, filled with a loss too deep for tears. I saw a white scar, his face a web of scars looking out towards the distant ruined spaceport, as if searching for a horizon that no longer existed. We, the common soldiers, the dregs of the Imperial army, were the most numerous of the wanderers. We moved in small, silent groups, or alone, our eyes vacant, our movements slow and shuffling. We saw each other, we recognized the shared uniform, the shared exhaustion, but we did not speak. There were no words left. What could one say? We had survived. That was all. I passed a guardsman from the Indigan prefects, one of the fresh-faced boys I had seen arrive what felt like a lifetime ago. He was sitting on a pile of rubble, his new, clean uniform now as torn and filthy as mine. He was staring at his hands, turning them over and over, as if they belonged to someone else. The zeal had been burned out of him, leaving only a hollow shell. He had been processed. We all wore the same expression. A blank 1,000-yard stare that looked through the ruins and the bodies and saw only the echo of the scream. We were the victors. We stood upon the sacred soil of Terra, the enemy broken and fled. But we looked like a defeated army. We had been hollowed out, our souls scoured by the sheer, unrelenting horror of what we had endured. We had paid for this victory with our sanity, our faith, and our very humanity. The price had been too high. I stopped in the middle of a plaza that was carpeted with the brass-skinned bodies of demons, their forms slowly dissolving back into the Imperium. I looked up at the palace, its highest spires still blazing with a defiant golden light. It stood. The throne was secure. We had done our duty. We had won. The word felt like ash in my mouth. I felt no pride, no relief, only a vast, crushing emptiness. This was not victory. This was just the end of the dying. Memory is a treacherous thing. It is a liar and a poet, a sculptor that chisels away the horror and leaves behind a monument to a glory that was never there. But I do not allow it. I force myself to remember the truth. I remember the mud. I remember the taste of fear and the weight of the dead. I remember the silence that came after the scream. I survived the siege. That is a simple statement of fact, but it holds no triumph. Survival was not a reward. It was a sentence to remember. In the days that followed, the giants returned. Guilliman stern and magnificent in his edger armor, his face a mask of cold, controlled grief. The lion dark and brooding, his gaze sweeping over the ruins with a terrible, vengeful fire. They came not as saviors, but as executors. The period of mourning was brutally short. The time for rebuilding would come later. First came the time for scouring. A new war was declared, a great scouring to purge the galaxy of the traitors, to burn their worlds and erase their names from history. The Imperium was saved, they said. A new age had begun. But I was still a soldier. The Chthonian 18th, the headhunters, was no more. Of the thousands who had made landfall on Terra, less than 100 of us remained. We were not enough to constitute a regiment. Our colors were retired, our names struck from the rolls. We were a footnote that had been erased. The survivors, myself included, were broken up and absorbed into new regiments being formed for the great war of vengeance. I ceased to be Olin of the Headhunters. I became just another anonymous guardsman in a sea of grey, my past a thing of whispers and nightmares that no one wanted to hear. There were no parades for us, no medals for the defenders of the lower walls. The histories would be written, the great tapestries woven. They would tell of the glory of the legions. They would sing of Dawn's defiance, of the Khan's charge, of the Lion's fury. They would deify Sanguinius the angel who gave his life at the feet of the throne. They would speak of the final terrible duel aboard the Vengeful Spirit. The official reports filed away in the dusty archives of the Administratum would note that the Astartes legions were supported by extensive elements of the Imperial army. Extensive elements. That was us. We were the billions of men and women who had been fed into the grinder. We were the foundation of their victory, a foundation built of our bones, cemented with our blood. Our reward for surviving the greatest battle in human history was a new laser gun, a fresh set of fatigues, and a transport ship to another war zone, and then another, and another. I fought in the Scouring. I fought on the worlds of the Iron Warriors, turning their fortresses into tombs. I hunted the remnants of the Night Lords in the dark of the Ghoul stars. I grew old in the service of an Imperium that did not know my name. With every passing year, the lines on my face deepened and the silence inside my soul grew wider. The memories of Terra never faded. They were not glorious war stories to be told in a barracks. They were ghosts. The ghost of Jax's frozen smile. The ghost of the Commissar's cold justice. The ghost of the hope I felt under the angel's wing, and the ghost of the grief that had murdered it. They walked with me on every world, a silent personal honor guard of the damned. And now I am an old man. My hair is the color of ash. My skin is a roadmap of scars. I am a sergeant posted to the wall of a forgotten outpost on a feral world whose name I can barely pronounce. My job is to stare out at a jungle that wants to kill us and teach young scared boys how to die for an emperor they will never know. Boys who have the same look in their eyes that I once did. Sometimes at the end of a long watch, I look up at the unfamiliar stars in the alien sky. I think of Terra, a place I can never return to, a memory that feels more real than the ground beneath my feet. I wonder if anyone in the grand teeming Imperium ever thinks of the common soldiers who died to save it. I wonder if any of the histories will ever mention our names, but I know the answer. They won't. I was there. I stood on the eternity wall when history held its breath. I saw gods and demons clash. I felt the death of one god and the birth of another. I was a witness to the forging of this new dark age. But I was not a hero. I was not a warrior of legend. I was a particle of dust, a single insignificant speck born of a dead world that was caught up in a divine whirlwind. And my story, my entire life, is nothing more than its faintest, most silent echo.